Anyway, got it. So yeah, the work I wanted to show is called Aviary. It was commissioned by the Tate St. Ives. St. Ives is in Cornwall, and it's in the southern western part of the UK. It's also, the gallery is kind of positioned in a kind of threshold space, like it's on the shoreline, so it's just kind of on the edge of land and sea. And to me, the entrance was very much like this gateway or portal into another world. And so the installation was a projection into the dome, ceiling dome of the entrance, but also it was a 360 live stream online. So the work itself was a computer simulation of birds in a virtual world. And the birds' behaviors were influenced by various live stream real-time data sets from the environment. So there were like local data sets like flooding, air pollution, rainfall. There was also oil prices, as well as global data sets like the magnitude of earthquakes, as well as lightning strikes from around the world. And so the work, I actually started it in 2020. And so at the time, there was just a huge amount of uncertainty over whether the gallery would be open or not. So I knew I wanted to create something which kind of straddled both physical and virtual space, both for those practicality reasons, but also just conceptually, like thinking about how one might experience this kind of a planetary body. So like extending that metaphor to these sensors in the landscape around the world as a kind of nervous system in which you would kind of be able to sense these fluctuations through the birds' movements within this kind of local, very hyper-local space of the gallery. Yeah, so I just this is a little video of like the installation there. It was accompanied by like this bird chart. The bird chart had some information about the real species of birds, as well as their kind of ecological significance. Most of the bird species that I chose were significant in Cornwall in the UK, but there were also like birds which have importance around the world. And also I was interested in the birds, their kind of symbolism as beings that travel across realms. So as kind of metaphysical beings traveling from the heavens, earth to the underworld, but also the migrations of birds across the world like swallows, as well as some symbolic birds like the chough is a symbol of Cornwall. It's on their crest, and it's said that the spirit of King Arthur was like migrated into a chough when he died. So that's the one in the corner here with the red beak. Yeah, so wait. This is the inside the 360 live stream. So this was streamed 24/7 for the course of 6 weeks. So it was very much like a durational piece. It had a kind of cyclical nature to it. So the lighting would change throughout the day. The birds were kind of constantly changing. And this was, you could like interact with it, with the image, yes. This is just like a screenshot that I made. So it says here, like this was the 12th of January 2022 at like around 8:40 a.m. So the soundscape, I collaborated with Ego and Robert Thomas, and it's also generative and responding to the same data. They were really interested in the kind of unfamiliar quality of like unknown species. So they were both using real samples of birds and kind of distorting the sounds. They were interested in as well in the kind of similarity of bird songs with electronic sounds and how you couldn't necessarily distinguish them. And yeah, and just like how one might extend the sounds of nature through technology into something entirely other. There was also the birds, so the way that they're flying, they're kind of aware of where the camera position is, so there's a kind of flopping offset, which is influencing like how close they come to the camera. And the projector that was the gallery was like positioned at the center here, pointing upwards, and that one like didn't have the camera tracking to it, so it was like running two simultaneous simulations. This is just to show you like the outside of it. So that was like kind of flying inside this cavernous space. But you know, part of this world building thing is like it actually is almost a place. You never actually see the extent of this island when in the work, in both the projection and the 360. But I like the idea that it kind of exists anyway, outside of your vision. Some of influences, inspirations for the world, the kind of Northern Hebrides, these kind of haunting Gothic landscapes off the coast of Scotland, as well as the Celtic history in Cornwall. They have incredibly rich like megalithic monuments across the landscape, as well as these Bronze Age labyrinths. And yeah, just thinking a lot about the construction of that virtual world and these kind of encoded symbolism within the graphic markings. So like those lines that you saw, they were the debug lines within the simulation. So they just show you velocity and direction and the predictive flight of the birds. And to me, like, you usually wouldn't reveal these kind of things, but I really like them as sort of revealing the underlying mechanism of the simulation, also like kind of breaking down that realism of it as well. So another thing was the spawning groves. So you might have seen these like orb spheres within the landscape. So the way in which the birds are, I guess, birthed into the world are through spawning. They're essentially voids that spawn into the world. And so I kind of wanted to elaborate the form of these sites, almost like sacred sites, where each of the different species had a different one. Yeah, so important slide. This is Clifford. He helped me build the world. A lot of time we spent just like where it seems almost like you're just doing more admin than art, just staring at spreadsheets or like flowcharts. But one of the things that I really find, especially working with technical mediums, is just like, and what Manijeh was talking about earlier, even my work at the AA, just like working with the idea of glitch. I don't necessarily like the word glitch, but this, the framing of failure, what failure is in relation to a work. I found some of these earlier iterations that we were working on, we were testing the simulation, very compelling. Just, there were these moments where like there would be overpopulation of the birds. There would be this kind of, the frame rate of the computer, you can see it like really suffering. In some sense, the simulation is a bit like a performance. Like we speak about the performance of a computer in terms of its graphics card capabilities or its CPU and its frame rate, and this kind of the performance here as being a failure. I couldn't like show this at the Tate St. Ives because it wouldn't last 6 weeks because the computer would crash. But I did really like the idea that these kind of could one day be shown as well. There's something as well that's a lot more like climate catastrophe that they speak to as images, I think. Next, and this was last year. I took the work to Seoul and it was installed in a traditional hanok. So it's like a 100-year-old tea house. It was different. It was like an LED screen taking the proportions of the windows of the house. And again, I like this idea of these virtual worlds, which you can adapt to different architectural surfaces, where you play with the window as a portal. And yeah, it was also adapted in terms of the data, taking local data from around Seoul as well. And then I just wanted to give you like a little glimpse of like what I'm working on at the moment. So I've got this show in Seoul coming up in September, and it's in vertical strawberry farm. So like hydroponic farm, quite in the center of Seoul. And another part of my body of work actually is looking into Korean soft power, like its technological soft power through LED screens, K-pop, and semiconductors, but also this side of Korea, which is like it's ancient technology. So it's like it has a very rich folk tradition. This image on the bottom right is I took in April. So part of the work is working with songs and music as kind of like energetic waveforms, but also these kind of ways of sustaining resonant relationships between people and communities and gods and landscapes. So these women are the Haenyeo, the diving ladies of Jeju, who are like in their 80s now. And so the work I'm creating is like a video work that will exist in the farm on an LED screen. The LED screen as a kind of light source, as an artificial light source for the growth of plants, but as well as like a screen for displaying content. So yeah, and then the bottom left is an image of cymatics. So it's another thing I'm working with, which is like cymatics is the visualization of sound in vibrational waveforms through any kind of elastic medium like water. So this is an image of water vibrating within a shell. Yeah, so that's kind of what I'm up to at the moment. And yeah, I'd be interested to hear if there's any questions, but also, yeah, if there's anything to do with Manijeh, you were saying about the photogrammetry and stuff, that is definitely part of my work that I've worked with in the past as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sami. Maybe if it's okay with you, bedtime wise, if I guess Chidi can present and then we can do a Q&A together.
Yeah, that sounds good.
That would be great.
Okay, let me share my screen.
Perfect.
So yeah, hey everyone. My name is Chidi Wubani, and I run a collective called LOOTY. We started just 2 years ago with what was a project that started just from an idea of, you know, how do we leapfrog over this whole bureaucratic system of returning artwork, but also not just the return of artwork, but the return of culture and the return of power. And I think that question is probably one of the most important things of how do we return the power and return that power of people being able to tell their own story. So LOOTY started with the Heist, which if any of you have seen the installation at the Biennale, you would have seen the video that goes through the performance/digital heist that we did. This also, I wanted to do this almost as a display of the process that it takes in actually acquiring these digital images. So we used photogrammetry. So once we got to the British Museum, we used photogrammetry to take scans of the Benin bronzes. So for those who don't know the history of the Benin bronzes, these were forcefully taken just over 100 years ago. sorry, 200 years ago from Benin, which is now in modern day Nigeria. I'm a Nigerian myself, and these artworks are very important to me and very important to the country. There's been, you know, roles of people. I think every decade there's another push for these to be returned. People have tried with legal legal petitions. People have tried with protests, and I think this generation, or our generation now, we're using like the digital. So how can we use the digital to somehow bring back these items? So we went into the British Museum and staged this digital heist. So using photogrammetry, we took scans of these and then turned them into the digital artifacts, and actually these were used as NFTs as well. So there was this concept that came up of digital surrogacy from Walter Benjamin, and in his book, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. So a digital surrogacy is basically a physical item and the aura of the physical item being translated into a digital. Now, like Benjamin, actually, he argued that you cannot take a physical item and turn it into a digital, and actually it loses quite a lot of its culture, its meaning when you turn it into a digital. But I would actually argue that with taking like the aura into a digital, you're actually creating something new. And the digital allows us to do things that the physical maybe can't do. For example, with the Benin bronzes, it's allowed us to give access to these artifacts to people that may not have been able to access them if they had not had the chance to travel to Britain, get the visas, you know, maybe have to pay for a hotel and go to the British Museum. And in that, with the physical, I think there is also this concept of a physical surrogacy. So the physical pieces do also take on this meaning, like an extra meaning when they've been taken away from their home. And there's this concept of or what I call the cold glass box. And you can see I recreated this in this piece. The cold glass box is what I would describe as what most museums are. Most museums are displaying artwork in maybe not in the form that they were originally shown or originally meant to be shown. And mind you, even if you take, for example, a lot of the Benin bronzes, when they were taken in the 1800s in Nigeria or in the Benin Kingdom at the time, no museum existed. The concept of museum did not exist at that time. So there's this change that happens to the physical over time, similar to the change that would happen when you turn it into the digital. I took this picture when I was at the museum in Pitt Rivers. And I thought it was interesting when I was there is that the way that like these items were being displayed, the way that the artifacts were being displayed at the time. A lot of these artifacts are from the eastern part of Nigeria, and they were typically used for like masquerades, sometimes used during festivals, sometimes used during celebration. But that aura that comes from the masquerade, that aura that comes from even the deities that embody inside of these artifacts has been kind of stripped away when you see them displayed in this kind of manner. Really, it's pretty much like I said, that cold glass box. They're there just to be looked at, but not really interacted with. And for me, it was kind of like disheartening at the same time to see things displayed like this, because I've actually seen these items being used in their physical form. So to see them being displayed like this and the aura not being able to be translated in the way that it should be was quite like disheartening. And then when you think about how a lot of the items were originally used, how well is this translated when you see them in this manner? There's this idea that I've always had about there being this huge gap between our ancestors and now, and the digital can actually bridge that gap where we can take inspiration from the history and bring it now to the digital age of today. And that's kind of what we were trying to represent in our installation here. So we had inside of this space, there's also the sound, and that sound we wanted to like represent the, you know, the commemoration and the celebratory like nature of like these art pieces. But then also you can interact with them in the digital while being in this physical space with the AR. So as you may have like gone around, you'll be able to scan the QR codes, and layered on top of this physical space is like the digital space that we had. And I think that's something that we can use to then take inspiration from what we've known from the past, leapfrog over this institution that we currently have of the museum, and find different ways for us to memorialize our history. And this was also done in another project that we did for the Rosetta Stone. Similar looted artifacts from Egypt, now also in the British Museum. We worked with Professor Monica Hanna and did the digital repatriation of this. So we went to the British Museum. We used, again, the same like LiDAR scanning, and took that same LiDAR scan back to Egypt, to the citadel in Egypt. So you can see here on the left, this is the original position of where the Rosetta Stone was, and where the French at the time digged up the stone. And it's quite poetic, it's quite symbolic to be able to like take it from the British Museum and then go all the way back to the town of Rosetta, which is actually known as Rashid. And in fact, the Rosetta Stone's original name is the Hajar Rashid, which goes back into this concept of power. So when you don't have the power to tell your own story, even the name of the artifacts that you own can be changed. So the Hajar Rashid, but commonly known as the Rosetta Stone, is now digitally back in its original place. So we used Snapchat with their location lenses, where you can map a particular lens to a geolocation. And there within the citadel, it was a very like stark juxtaposition from what we saw in the British Museum. From the British Museum, there was like crowds of people, crowds of tourists, but the citadel in Rashid was quite empty at the time. But we did like manage to see that there were like a lot of school children around, and at the time, we managed to like place the stone there, and we actually were able to get them to like interact with it and use the AR experience. So I think for the future, this is something that could work as not just as a replacement, but for the physical, but to work in conjunction with that physical piece, because there's a lot of more things that we can do inside of the digital. And yeah, that's it. Thank you for like listening to like the two projects that we have at LOOTY.
Thank you so much. Two really great presentations. I guess maybe to open it up to questions. Anyone have any questions? Yeah, I have to project or I can see here. Should I put that?
Yeah.
No, it'll create feedback. I think that is to just speak. Yeah. So you can probably speak from that.
Thank you very much for the presentations. I just have a question on the last part with the techniques of the photogrammetry and scanning of looted artifacts and bringing them back to the original place. And how do you think this fits in, like in the long haul of actually bringing these items in the physical form to the place? Do you think it's like it's a big step in bringing these items when people see this in place, so they would actually gather more momentum to actually bring these items, or it might have a counter effect where the digital would be always more accessible, so you can always see it, so the pressure is not, is less.
Yeah, so it's like you're saying that they would say, oh well, the digital is there now, so we can keep the physical. You guys can just have the digital. And yeah, I mean, there's also like we're galvanizing like a lot of like attention, and there's a petition that's going on right now for the return of the Rosetta Stone, and the hope was that the fact that we're doing this and we're able to get like enough attention about this subject is for the Egyptian government to actually take this up and ask for the return of the physical. The physical coming back represents, it's not so much the actual physical artifact is the representation, but it represents the power that somebody has over your own story. So I think that is the thing that was like, once the physical comes back, it's that power that then changes, that someone else is not telling your story, it's you that's able to tell your story, even to the point of when I was in Egypt, some of the signs that you saw in close to the pyramids were in English, right? The bigger signs were in English, and then a smaller like sign there was in Arabic. It's like, what is that telling the people of like that country? Is that, oh well, the tourists or the people from outside are more important than you? It's like, it should be those people from that country telling their story first in their own language first. So I think, yeah, the what we're trying to do is galvanize enough like attention for the physical to come back and for that power to also come back.
I think just because both of you presented, I guess, two projects, but Sammy, in your case, you showed us like one project in two places, and I was wondering what the impact of showing the aviary in Seoul, like how it was different to showing it in the UK.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I'm working more in Korea now, and I think there's definitely like a different relationship or cosmology around technology and media in Korea and in East Asia. So also like the context in which it was shown was different as well, right? Because it was in this old like traditional house in the garden. But the way that it was kind of read from the public in this kind of context was very much as like landscape painting almost. Whereas in the UK, I think people were a lot more interested in a kind of didactic message of what the work was trying to say. Maybe like they were interested in the environmental aspect of it. Whereas in Korea, that was less of a topic or a discussion point. But yeah, I think it's that might have also been because of the way that the work is like part of the architecture, right? It's like it can't be like divorced from it almost.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Chidrim, thanks for the presentation to both artists. Chidrim, I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned that there's sort of this glass box effect that happens in preservation in museums. And you spoke of how these objects or artifacts sort of how they interact or how they live in life and how they in the glass box. I was wondering if are you interested in representing the objects in those sort of ways? And if so, like, are there explorations on that you've done?
So I think you kind of cut out for a second, but I think the question was around the like original form, right? The original form of these objects and how those are being represented, right?
Yeah. How if it's possible to represent them in the form, in their like dynamic form, or yeah.
So what we've like attempted to do is to take reference from the original form, reference from how these artifacts would have been used, would have been interacted with to create something new, right? And I think it's that reference that makes the like digital form so much more like special for us. A lot of things that I've seen online are just where people create like a digital museum where they're basically referencing the physical museum that we have. But, you know, for me, myself, that one of the actual issues is that institution of the museum, the fact that we don't have any other ways of displaying, memorializing history, right? We only have this one way, which is via a museum. And I find it interesting that when some of these items that they get returned, they get returned back to a museum in their home country, and maybe not necessarily back to their original home, where maybe it would have been a in a palace, or maybe it would have been at a shrine, and it just shows you the extent to how much we've lost over time in terms of culture, in terms of history. But like, there's nothing you can do to change the past, but we also can't stop there, right? Just because there's a lot of damage has been done, we shouldn't stop there, and we should think about the future. So in thinking about that future, we're always referencing the past, always referencing history.
Cool, thanks. Yeah.
Hello. I have a question about the pattern that you used for the masks, because it is a pattern that is very familiar to me as a Moroccan. We use it in some bags in the north of Morocco, and they are called the northern bags. So I would like to know, what does it represent to you, and what is the value for your work?
So in researching more, I found, so in northern Morocco, they call them the Northern Moroccan bags. And why do they call them the Northern Moroccan bags?
I don't know.
Oh,
I have
okay.
no idea,
'Cause
because since I was little, I like, it's a bag that are very familiar to me. We use them like
yeah.
for transportations, and when you want
Mhm.
to move, you use, because they are very huge bags there. You can put a lot of things inside. And when
Yeah.
I saw your work in the Biennale, I was like, this pattern is very familiar to me, and I had this question. So
Yeah.
I'm very happy to ask you this question.
So I made that mask out of using fiberglass, and I took the bag and I made a mold and created the mask from that bag, and then we used those bags. So it was very important that we use those bags as well in the reference that those bags have. So in Nigeria, they actually call those bags Ghana Must Go. Yeah.
Okay.
And they call Ghana Must Go because there was a time in Nigeria where the oil price had dropped, and there was a lot of xenophobia around that time to the Ghanaian immigrants at that time, and they kicked a lot of the Ghanaian immigrants out of Nigeria. So they coined the word Ghana Must Go, because it's like they gave them that bag and they told them to leave, right? But then you usually see that bag being used for travel, people moving from across the country, going from one part of Nigeria to the other, even from overseas. And I even think there was one point where KLM they banned that bag, right? I spoke to someone from Poland, and in Poland they call that the Russia bag, because there were a lot of Russian immigrants at the time that used to use that bag. So I think globally it has that idea of transportation. And then what were we doing in the beginning? We were going to the British Museum and taking back. So it was all about taking back. We're going on a travel and a journey back home.
Okay. So it makes sense now, because in Moroccan we say sac de chamal, which is northern bags. So now I understand.
Yeah. Yeah, it was all to represent traveling back home and a journey.
All right. Thank you so much.
I just had one question, Chidi and Samantha. Just around the kind of the mediums you use. I'm quite fascinated because I think they're both around like truth telling in a way, like it's a way of representing something that was invisible before. But I would also imagine that, you know, in the process of documenting, it becomes something new that is also now in, I guess, in your hands as designers or artists to adjust things. And to what extent do you allow yourself to control that, or, you know, I mean, do you remain quite strict on how much can change, or, you know, is it about just relaying something from the physical to the digital, or are there adjustments that you occupy, and they create this third thing that's never existed before, which, I mean, I know you do, but yeah, there's, I guess, a politics in the decision making behind that as designers. That's a question for either of you or both of you.
Yeah, good question. So a couple things. One would be that I guess the last 20 years has been all about this kind of debate about virtual versus physical, and does one have an aura, does one not? What is the value of a replica, and that kind of relation? And I guess the way I started to imagine the virtual realm, and this also like came from architecture as well, which is that it pre-exists the physical in many ways, or it has always coexisted with it, in a sense of virtuality being pre-digital, pre-technological. An example that one of my favorite examples is the mandala, right? Like the mandala as an image is a inner visualization of a universe, but it's also a mnemonic device. It's also a spatial plan, an organization of something. So it's all of these things. And in one aspect, I find the physical to be almost like a hindrance on possibilities of what one might be able to do with virtual tools. So I've become more and more like into thinking about like it, you know, multi-dimensionality. You know, it's also within our lifetimes we might actually be able to discover how to properly represent 4-dimensional space, in which case we'll start to speak about 3-dimensional space as if it's like passé, you know, it's like 2D. You know, there's also the aspects of like the intensified trajectories of like altered states of consciousness, whether through psychedelics or through various trance states, ecstatic techniques. That kind of level of virtuality, I would say, or this kind of like this hyperdimensionality is very much akin to working with digital tools. So yeah, I think that it's just as real, and it kind of like once it sort of loosens its responsibilities, I guess, towards realism, there's way more potential. Maybe a parallel to that might be the way that painting was all realism until modernism, till cubism like broke down those forms. Suddenly photography came along. Photography took over the role of realism and suddenly freed up the space of the canvas to be an expression of something abstract, or to express it, the invisible, like at the turn of the 19th century when it was kind of all about the discovery of the electromagnetic spectrum as being like proof of a spiritual realm, I guess, and the paintings that kind of resulted from that. So yeah, I guess I think that there will be a loosening of that as well within virtual space, basically, and there is already is happening. So they can both have their own realities and discussions around them.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Thank you. Chidi, I don't know if you had any to add to that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I was just thinking about like the relationship between like technology and like the spiritual realm, and how like Sammy was talking about that there's always been like another realm that we've always had, right? And how do we mix those two? Because I think a lot of the artifacts that I reference, they embody like an aura, and they embody a spirit into that actual physical artifact. But then once that physical artifact is gone or has been displaced, where does that aura go? Can that also live within like the digital space? And yeah, there are a lot more things that we can do inside the digital space. And if we're looking at it from the perspective of like museums and being able to educate people, there's so many more things that can be added into that artifact as well.
Mm.
And another thing I was thinking about was this book called Shangzai. It's by Byung-Chul Han. Don't know if you know it, but Shangzai is the Chinese word to refer to this culture of copying and imitation. So, you know, like the fake Gucci or the, you know, fake Prada. But in the book, it does speak about, as you may know it already, but this temple in Japan, which they rebuild every 20 years as a way of preserving it. So they've got 2 plots of land that are just next to each other. And every 20 years, they rebuild it on the plot next to it and take all the artifacts inside, put them in the new building and destroy the old one. And it's this idea that the preservation of something is not about the original. It's the idea that's held in it and that can be moved into another physical body. And it's actually a closer way of reenacting and preserving something as an original. So this idea of letting, like in Europe, like these ruins, like basically your most sacred treasures just like being fragments and ruins is kind of an absurd notion, really. Yeah.
Maybe as like a make a final follow on to that. I was just wondering, like, what you think the role of institutions should be in the future, because I think, Chidi, you were talking about how there weren't museums in the past, and I think both of you kind of work with cultural institutions and have your work displayed as part of them, but also operate outside of them, or like as extra institutional. And so, yeah, I was just wondering, especially like given that you both work with the digital and the physical, what do you think the role of institutions might be in the future?
I can answer this. Like, I think the role is definitely gonna change a lot. I think the power that institutions have is gonna be fragmented a lot more. There's gonna be a lot more voices and even individuals that have their own power to start telling their stories and representing like their own history. At the current time, I think a lot of institutions are trying to catch up with like technology, but also there's with what we're doing, there's a big social demand for the history to be like rechanged, the history to be like adapted, and I think until that happens, I don't see that there's going to be a way for museums in particular to move forward. And there's going to be more people that are coming out with other alternatives to, you know, what that could be.
Yeah, I would kind of agree. Like I tend to avoid institutions. I know I showed the thing at Tate St. Ives, but that's like, to me, they are kind of a peripheral institution from the Tate in London, as in they operate quite with a different level of autonomy. But it's, I mean, from what I can see, like people I know, there's like this real drain of talent happening, and as in people are leaving institutions, very talented curators and researchers and artists, and people are just generally choosing to go elsewhere, which to me signals that actually this dispersion and hopefully collecting, coagulating in the same places hopefully means the building of new organizations and cultural centers, and this kind of like the center moving to the periphery, but not in like a leveling up UK sort of way, which is just like top down and fake, but like actually, yeah, it's probably just the institutions are struggling and will, yeah, I can't really see a way for them to reorganize from within. I think it has to come from outside, basically, and just like the redistribution of power.
Great. I think redistribution of power is a great note to end on. Thank you both so much for two such fantastic talks, and also for the conversation. And doubly so for doing it later.
So late, yeah. Thank you. It was very generous of you.
And
Yeah,
yeah,
thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks. I actually don't feel tired because it was very engaging. So
Yeah, for us too.
yeah, and yeah, it's great to at least be all together virtually. So thank you so much for being so generous with your time and your ideas. And hopefully see you soon.
Yeah,
yeah,
thank
good
you.
luck with your projects.
Yeah, thank you. Bye. See you soon, Joe.
Yeah,
Bye.
bye.
See you guys. Goodbye.